Politico.com this morning, titled, "Could Putin Be Failing Because of a Lack of Democracy?" And, there's so many people asking this question, why did Putin make this insanely stupid decision to attack Ukraine? He apparently genuinely believed that his soldiers would be greeted with flowers, which, by the way, has parallels to America and Iraq. And I think that the same problem is what's playing out here, but I'll get to that in a minute. But, how did he miss this? How did he make a decision that is going to, destroy his reputation for all of history and badly damage his own country? Whether he wins or loses, whether he takes Ukraine or not, and it's increasingly looking like he won't. So some people have suggested that the reason why is because Putin has surrounded himself with yes men. And, there's some pretty good evidence that he absolutely has. In fact, particularly that Frontline documentary. I put the YouTube clip of it, embed it right into the story at Hartmann Report. And you can watch it. It's only 3.5 minutes. And it's just shocking where Putin is saying, well, do you think I should invade Ukraine? And his head of intelligence gets up and says, well, there are issues. And Putin says, yes or no? And, oh, yes, sir. Yes, please. Oh, please, don't kill me. This is the guy that Putin ordered arrested yesterday. This Frontline documentary is from like 2 weeks ago, 2.5, almost 3 weeks ago now. So that's one theory, that it's all yes men. The second theory is that the failure of his invasion to win was because he's privatized. This was, Milton Friedman's neoliberalism. Privatize all your functions, right? It's, turn everything over to big corporations. And so Russia has their equivalent of a military-industrial complex. It's, if you can imagine, it's even more corrupt than the one here in the United States. And these oligarchs have been skimming money off the top to the point that the head of the Ukrainian National Agency on Corruption Prevention, the director, his name is Alexander Novikov, sent a special message to Russia's defense minister Shoigu, thanking him for having sent tanks into battle, and instead of having metal armor around the sides of them, they have egg cartons. Hey, it looks great in photographs. And instead of the soldiers wearing bulletproof vests with ceramic or metal in them, they're made with cardboard. No kidding. So that's another theory. Another theory is that, Putin's simply gone mad, or his brain has been addled by COVID. And, there are people pointing to the fact that he won't let anybody get more than 30 feet from him and all this kind of stuff as proof of that. I think the answer is much simpler than any of these things. Or you could argue that all of these things are symptoms of the real answer, the much larger answer. And that is that Russia is failing for a lack of democracy. That Putin is failing because of a lack of democracy. Seriously, and people would ask, can it really be that simple? We're the founders of this republic and the founders of every country that has followed our lead and become a democracy since the 1780s. Could they have been that brilliant? Or is it that just like intrinsic and core to our humanity that democracy always works better? And my assertion is that the answer is yes. And let me build the case here. This word didn't exist back when the Constitution was written, but what democracy essentially is crowdsourcing. The idea of crowdsourcing is that the greater the number of inputs, the greater the number of eyeballs on a problem, the more likely you are to have an honest and factual response. Aristotle wrote about this in Politics. He just explicitly said it. He said that it is more proper for the multitude to be sovereign than the few of greatest virtue. And then he goes through and explains why. Even if you've got the very best people, they can't govern as well as everybody. Back in 1906, Sir Francis Galton tried a famous experiment where he was at a county fair and they had an ox that had been butchered and dressed. So there's this giant pile of meat and bones, right? And he asked, random passersby at this county fair to guess the weight of this pile of meat. 787 people during the course of the fair. I don't know how long it lasted, probably a few days. The median guess, Galton carefully recorded every single one of those 787 guesses. The median guess was that the ox weighed 1,197 pounds. When they were all done, they weighed it, and it weighed 1,198 pounds. The crowd was off by 1 pound. And scales being what they were back then, it might have actually been that the crowd was right and the scales were wrong. This wisdom of the crowd is why we have juries when things involve, life or death issues or freedom or, putting somebody in jail. It's why companies ask for customer feedback so that they can do rapid course correction. It's why we look at the reviews, the ratings of the crowd when we're thinking about buying a product online. It's why we look to and have faith in crowdsourced products. Yes, they have their flaws, but and some of them have been corrupted somewhat, but nonetheless, at its core, we know that the earlier crowdsourced versions of Linux and Firefox and the current version of Wikipedia are generally fairly reliable. It's also why every advanced democracy in the world, except America, makes it super easy to vote, because they want the majority of people to participate in the democracy, and then you're going to have elections that actually make sense. Putin's Russia, though, Russia was a democracy for a couple of years. I was in Kaliningrad in 1999 when the first election was held, when Boris Yeltsin was elected. It was an actual democratic, small d democratic election. Within a couple of years, Putin, who, Yeltsin basically picked, had taken over, and that was kind of the end of that. But it was the end of that because of the so-called neoliberal reforms that we put in place, or that we helped them put in place. The whole Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush thing that Bill Clinton even got in on the act on in the era between 1991, when the Berlin Wall fell, and 1994, when Ukraine gave up their missiles and Russia was really seriously making the transition. So what you have now is, Russia made the transition from a communist nation to a democracy that lasted for a year or so, a couple of years, to a oligarchy as a result of neoliberalism, as a result of Reaganism, and from there to a strongman dictatorship. And strongman dictators have a long, long history, going all the way back to the Caesars, of making stupid decisions that hurt them and their countries. And sure enough, there it is. And there's a lesson in this for us. We've got a Republican Party that has fully embraced not only neoliberalism, but also authoritarianism. They are congratulating people for political violence like January 6th and supporting racialized violence, all the attacks on BLM and all this other stuff. This is all this is the mother's milk of the Republican Party now. And the result of that is that, and they're trying to suppress the vote, and the result of that is that we're having less and less democracy. Somebody on Twitter this morning, after reading my article, said, well, yeah, but, we don't have a democracy here either. Look at, George W. Bush lying us into the war in Iraq. And I'm like, you're absolutely right. This is the Supreme Court put George W. Bush into office. When the Florida Supreme Court said, let's recount the vote, and this was, obviously after Jeb Bush had removed the names of 90,000 African Americans in Florida from the voting rolls because there were felons in Texas with similar names. So the election was rigged. Of course, we ended up with George Bush, and we ended up with terrible decision-making because he figured, hey, no matter what I do, I'm in charge. Remember when George W. Bush said it would be a whole lot easier if I were a dictator? Or if America was a dictatorship, just so long as I get to be the dictator? Which he thought was a punchline, a joke. We've got to we have to understand that it's authoritarianism that comes out of neoliberalism that has destroyed, or that is in the process of destroying, Russia and Putin's presidency. And that very same authoritarianism, or a slightly milder strain of it, but essentially at its core, the same thing, is what brought Donald Trump into the White House, and had he stayed in the White House for another 4 years, would have ended democracy in the United States. And we need to build the guardrails. We need to build the protections. We need to return to democracy. And, frankly, one of the main obstacles right now to that is the Supreme Court, asserting that oligarchy is just fine, thank you very much. And when oligarchs own politicians, that's their right. We now have You know, now it's out in the open. Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin are getting money from the right-wing billionaires who fund the Republican Party. It's right out there. This is the kind of stuff that destroys democracies.